State may call its next witness.
State call it Jill Hayes. Your name, please?
My name is Jill Hayes.
And what do you do for a living?
I am a forensic neuropsychologist.
And where do you work?
I work here in Arizona as well as in Louisiana.
When you say that you work here in Arizona as well as Louisiana, are you licensed in the state of Arizona?
I am.
Are you licensed in the state of Louisiana?
I am.
Where do you live?
What
state?
I live in Louisiana.
And in terms of your education, when did you receive your bachelor's degree?
I'm sorry?
When did you receive your bachelor's degree?
In 1990.
From where?
From Armstrong State College in Savannah, Georgia.
And what was the area of study?
It was in psychology.
And after you graduated, did you continue on with your studies or did you go do something else?
No, I kept going.
And did you go to the same school or go somewhere else?
Somewhere else.
Where did you go?
I went to Augusta State College in Augusta, Georgia.
And at Augusta State College, what degree did you receive?
I received a master's degree in applied psychology.
And what year was that?
That was in 1992.
After that, did you continue your studies?
I took a year off.
And during that year, did you work in the area of psychology or not?
I did.
What did you do?
I was a psychometrist for a neuropsychologist, which means I did testing.
And then after that, what school did you go to?
I went to Louisiana State University.
So what year would that have been?
I started in 1993.
And when did you graduate?
I graduated from LSU in 1998.
And when you graduated in 98, that would mean you had your doctorate, correct?
Correct.
Once having your doctorate, can you practice or do you have to wait to be licensed?
At that point in time, you had to do another year before you could actually sit for the licensing exam.
And that year of study that you had, where did you accomplish that?
I did that at LSU Health Sciences Center, the School of Medicine in New Orleans.
And what did you do there in terms of your training?
I was on faculty at LSU and also concurrently did a fellowship in forensic psychology and neuropsychology.
When you say you were a faculty at LSU, what does that mean? What did you do?
I was hired as an assistant professor, and I just want to make sure, I think I said something incorrectly. You could take the licensing exam during the year, but you had to take the oral exam at the end of the year, so I didn't want to be confusing. But I was an assistant professor, which meant that I had to wear a number of different hats, which would include teaching, research, seeing patients, doing administrative work.
And so when were you licensed?
I was licensed in 1999.
And after being licensed, where did you begin to work?
At the same place. I stayed at LSU School of Medicine.
What did you do there?
I continued as an assistant professor until I was promoted later. Then I was an associate professor and then continued on. And
I'm sorry, somebody coughed. I didn't hear what you said.
I continued on after I was promoted to an associate professor. I was with LSU for about 8 years.
And while you were with LSU for about 8 years, what were you doing? I know you said you were a professor, assistant professor, but what were your duties?
Again, you did a number of different things. You had to do teaching, you had to do research, you had to see patients, administrative work, and so I did a number of different things.
And after that, where did you begin working after those 8 years?
After those 8 years, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, and the med school, part of the med school is underwater. And so I actually came out here and I started teaching at ASU, and I started working with a forensic psychiatrist, Stephen Pitt. And so I've been doing work with him since out here, and then back in New Orleans, a private practice there as well.
And your practice, what does it consist of? Is it seeing patients or is it something else? Explain to me what your practice is.
My practice now is mostly forensic psychology or neuropsychology, doing evaluations of folks. I still on occasion see people that I had seen prior to Hurricane Katrina. When I was at the med school, I was the I worked at the HIV clinic, and so I still see some of those folks from time to time. And I also see police officers who are having difficulties as well.
And as part of your work, does that entail testifying in proceedings such as this?
It does.
And how often have you done that?
Probably around 75 times I've testified.
And your current caseload, in terms of plaintiff and defendant, what's the split?
My current caseload.
Of cases where you testify, what's the split in terms of prosecution and defense?
We keep, in my field, you keep 4 years of your testimony according to the federal rules of evidence. And so today I will be 50-50. So 50% prosecution, 50% defense.
Are you familiar with a test called the TSI?
I am.
First of all, what does that acronym stand for?
It stands for the Trauma Symptom Inventory.
And what is that test used for?
It's measured to, or it's used to measure symptoms of depression, anxiety, different difficulties that a person may have as a result of a trauma.
And does that require there to be a trauma for that test to be given in the realm of a forensic evaluation? Where does that come in?
I would probably give it in the realm of trauma, just because that's its intended purpose.
Is that the first thing that you would do when somebody walks in, or do you have to have sort of an indication that there was some trauma that was involved?
I would think you would have to have an indication that there was some trauma. I mean, each person's different, so you have to figure out why they're coming to see you and then proceed accordingly.
So let's say in this case, the presentation of the trauma was that the individual took a test, and I'll show it to you. Are you familiar with what the PDS is?
I am.
What is it?
It's the Post-Traumatic Stress Diagnostic Scale. It's another paper and pencil test where a person fills out basically yes or no to various symptoms that they could have, or rates them on a scale between, say, 0 and 3 as to how bad something is, the particular item in question.
And with regard to this particular test, are you familiar with the PDS test in this case?
No.
In terms of this particular case, have you reviewed any of the PDS tests that were given?
No.
Let's say, are you familiar with question 14, though?
Question 14?
Yes, of the test that is administered of the PDS.
No.
Is there a question that deals with what trauma is involved?
I believe so.
And with regard to that question that deals with the trauma, what if there's a situation, for example, if the trauma or the traumatic event that is spoken of turns out to be untruthful or a lie?
That would give you concern, of course.
What does that do to the validity of this PDS test, the results?
If the reason that the person was given the test is a lie, then it calls into question everything else that the person had indicated on the test.
Would you blindly, with regard to a test, if you knew the person had lied on the PDS, would you continue on and say, well, no, they may have lied about this trauma, but I'm still going to consider this to be valid because there could have been some other trauma that they were referring to? Is that how this test is done?
Can you rephrase the question?
Let's say that the trauma or the incident involving the trauma is a lie, and then the person answers the PDS based on that lie. Mm-hmm. Every one of the symptoms that they exhibit or that they acknowledge is based on a lie. Let's assume that. If that's the case, how valid could that test be if the event that supposedly triggers this is a lie?
If what you're telling me is that the event was a lie and that every answer was a lie, then of course the test would be invalid.
Well, no. Could it be a situation that somehow, as a psychologist, you could divine that or see that if the answer was a lie, what confidence do you then have that whatever answers are then made after that, what confidence do you have that they're the truth? if you have an event that's a lie to start with?
I would be very concerned, because if you know 100% for sure that something is a lie, then how do you know that what else is being told to you or what's being answered is the truth?
And so in that circumstance, would you then say, well, if we have a lie to start with, would you then use that sort of as a starting point, even though you know that the event that's listed is a lie? Or would you do, or would you do something else?
Objection, Judge, may we approach?
Are you familiar with the term called a floating profile? Are you familiar with that?
I am.
What is a floating profile?
A floating profile refers to a profile on the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, whereby of the 10 clinical scales, 8 are, almost 8 are in the elevated range, which would be above what's called a T-score of around 65 to 70.
And with regard to that particular profile, are you familiar with who coined it or who came up with it?
I am.
Who was that?
It was a person named Strong in 1957.
So was it, are you sure it wasn't somebody by the last name of Gatchel?
I am.
And so it was Strong, okay. And what else do you know about this?
What do you mean?
In other words, he came up with it, and what did it mean when he came up with it?
Basically, it meant when a person had this type of elevated profile kind of across the board, that a person is definitely experiencing arousal, the person's overwhelmed, and so it also was applied to folks with borderline personality disorder.
Exhibit 631, this is an MMPI profile. Are you familiar with, have you seen that before?
I believe so.
And when we were talking about these floating profiles, is that what we're talking about?
Yes.
And so what is, because we're talking floating, what is floating about this profile? In other words, why is this a floating profile?
Can you?
Well, there's a something.
Can I point?
Do you see that? Now you can hit the pencil thing.
Pencil? Okay.
Yeah, and then mark, or the arrow, whichever one you want.
I'll try it with this hand. Those particular scales are all above this line, which is the 65 line, which I was saying is the point at which one would consider that to be elevated. So these scales that I tried really inartfully to circle are all above that. And so that's what is floating about it, is that they're all elevated.
And with regard to this floating profile, in terms of whether or not it can have any indications or any applicability to borderline personality disorder, is that an outdated concept that has gone by the wayside, or what's going on with that?
It's not something that's discussed frequently, because it is a pretty antiquated term, but it's still available, it's still researched, and it's still used.
Would you agree? We've had an individual here who testified that, well, this has been changed, and it's no longer valid, and that Dr. Gatchel has, in fact, said that this floating profile, the concept is no longer valid as it applies to borderline personality disorder. Is that what your research has indicated?
With all due respect, I would disagree.
Why?
Because Dr. Gatchel did some research in 2006. Dr. Gatchel is a psychologist who works at University of Texas, Arlington with spinal disorder patients and people who have other sorts of I guess, bodily injuries. And he did not say that the floating profile was not valid. He then changed the name for his purpose and said, I'm going to call this now the disability profile because I'm using it with my spinal disorder patients or my spinal pain patients, and then did research on that. And what his research showed was that in his spinal disorder patients, it was still indicating folks that had borderline personality disorder.
Are you familiar, we were talking about the TSI, are you familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
Let me find the TSI listings. Exhibit number 646. If you could just tap the arrow there. I think it, tap it. There you go. With regard to this trauma symptom inventory test, what is it that this test does, or what is it measuring?
This test is intended to measure symptoms that may result from trauma or from some sort of experience that a person has that they experience to be causing them intense helplessness, horror, and other things like that.
This TSI, there was a TSI 1 and a TSI 2, correct?
That's right.
The TSI 1, when did the TSI 2 come into effect?
The TSI 2 was published in February of 2011.
And the TSI 1 that was administered in this case, when was that?
In August of 2011, so about 7-ish months later.
One of the things that the previous witness testified to was that if you don't use the TSI 2 the next day after it comes out, that somehow you're incompetent. Do you agree with that?
Objection to Stacy's testimony.
Overruled. You may answer the question.
Ma'am?
You may answer the question.
Thank you. No, absolutely not. That's not true.
Was there a problem, and as you see it in this case, that there was a lapse of time between the TSI, when after the TSI 2 came into effect, that the TSI 1 was still being used? There's a period there. Do you see a problem with the TSI being administered on the date it was administered, even though the TSI 2 was available?
No.
Why is that?
Well, because after a new test gets released, many people would like to make sure that the new test is just as good as the old test. And so they wait for additional research to be done to ensure that the new test actually works and does what it's supposed to and is actually better. And so many psychologists will wait and just make sure that the new one that came out is just as good.
And so do you see any, by problem, I mean any psychological deficiency in waiting in this particular case and still using the TSI 1 even though the TSI 2 was available?
No, and in fact, the peer-reviewed literature does not suggest that either.
So in other words, you're saying those that do this type of research doesn't suggest that either?
What I'm saying is that there has been, like for example, an article published in the Clinical Neuropsychologist in 2010 that's saying when should we use these new tests, and that there is no standard for when one should switch from one test to another, and it depends on the judgment of the clinician. And if the clinician has a good reason for why he or she doesn't want to switch to the new one yet, well then that must be respected.
This test includes some summary scales, correct?
It can.
And when you say that it can, are you familiar with this test if it's scored not by computer but by hand?
I am. That's actually the one that I was, I guess, raised on.
And with regard to scoring it by hand, is there a requirement anywhere by the people that have this test or the patent on this test, or anywhere in the literature that requires or indicates that the best course to take is to have these summary scales after you do this test and you score it?
No.
And what are you relying on to say that?
I'm relying on two things. One is the fact that when you have the hand scoring, well, I guess three things. One is when I was trained at the National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center in Charleston, South Carolina, We didn't do the summary scales there that I can recall. It's been a few years, but I don't recall them. We used the hand scoring, and we didn't have the computer scoring. And on the hand scoring profile form, there actually is no spot for you to be able to write the summary scores or calculate it. The third thing would be that I contacted the test publisher and just asked, and they said that the...
Objection, hearsay.
Sustained.
Ma'am, is this as part of an expert that you are? When you reach an opinion, do you sometimes go out and read articles?
Absolutely.
And as part of this research as an expert, do you also talk to the people, for example, that create this test?
In some cases I would. When you
How about in this one?
In this one I did.
And is that part of, does that form your opinion in this particular case as to whether or not the summary scales are required or in your view have to always be in this test?
Yes.
And what is it that you learned after speaking with them? Why don't you tell us what you learned rather than saying he or she said? What did you learn about the requirement that there be this summary attached to these scales?
I guess I didn't learn anything new. I learned that it wasn't a requirement. I just wanted to make 100% sure.
Okay, so you actually confirmed what you already knew, right?
Exactly.
And who is it that you spoke to, the organization?
A representative from the organization.
Objection, foundation, which organization?
Sustained.
Go ahead, tell me, who did you contact? What organization?
And I had phone and electronic correspondence with a person named Terry Lyon.
Okay.
Same objection.
The name of the organization.
Do you remember the...
Yes, ma'am. Psychological Assessment Resources, and the acronym is PAR.
Thank you.
And what we're really talking about with regard to the summary scales are these things right here, right?
Yes.
And those scales, the other scales that are here in the middle, are these what are these then?
Those are just the clinical scales.
And do you need to have this? Is it absolutely imperative that you have these summary scales here in order to know what these other scales, the ones that were actually scored, mean?
Objection asked and answered.
Overruled.
No.
And when you were in your practice and based on what you know in the literature, can you just go, can you go and look at those and then make an assessment or make a determination as to what's going on?
Certainly. I mean, if you had like 25 scales or something like that, maybe it would be nice to have a summary scale, but to have 3 summary scales for only 10 scales, you can just look at the 10.
You are familiar with the MMPI, correct?
Yes.
And this is exhibit number 631. What is the MMPI?
The MMPI is probably the most commonly used test of psychopathology and personality that is given by psychologists.
And is this of any use in making a determination as to whether or not an individual may be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder?
It's helpful, but it's not the end-all be-all. You've got other pieces of the puzzle.
When you say that there are other pieces of the puzzle, what are you talking about?
What I mean is that no competent psychologist that I know would base his or her opinion solely on a test. You want to use the test to hopefully validate or confirm other pieces of data that you would receive, like a forensic interview, collateral information from other people, records that you have, observations of the person that you see. And what you want is for all of the data to point into the same direction, and then you can be really sure that what you are saying is accurate.
And you're talking in the perfect world. Is it a situation that every case that comes through a psychologist's door fits all the criteria all the time, and there's all this corroborative data out there, or is there a situation where the psychologist has to make a decision?
I wish it was. I mean, that would make our jobs a lot easier, but people are all different, and we're not always consistent. And so, no.
And is this just, as they say, part of the whole in making an assessment in reaching a diagnosis.
Yes. I mean, a diagnosis is not going to rise and fall with the results of a test.
And if you, for example, just looked at the MMPI, the TSI, and the PDS, if you just looked at those 3 tests as well as the MCMI, would you be able to then say, you know, I believe that this person has PTSD or has borderline personality disorder? Can you do that?
No, you can. In fact, you're cautioned against that.
What is required even if you have all of these tests that are administered?
What's required is that you actually do an evaluation, and as part of the evaluation, it would be helpful to do an interview. It really depends on the situation. I mean, you're using these tests to develop hypotheses about someone, to develop ideas about what may or may not be wrong with them that you either then need to confirm or deny through other sources of information.
In terms of the MMPI-2, if you're going to administer this test, is it a situation where you just sit there and you begin to talk to the individual without any more and just give them this test, or is there any other kind of work that needs to be done before you actually administer the test?
Objection, Major Devotion. Yes.
So you just throw that in front of the person that you're going to have that filled out? Is that how it's done by the psychologist, the elite psychologist?
No.
Well, is it something that you then sit and you say to them, can you read, for example, extended score report, or read something, and then you say, okay, you can go ahead and fill it out? Is that how it's done?
Can you ask me that question again?
For example, would it be a situation where you're going to administer this, that is there a determination that has to be made as to some level of confidence for the person who's going to take it in terms of reading ability before you administer it?
Absolutely.
And why is that? Why not just, assume? That's all right. You've talked to them. You've sort of seen them reading it. Shouldn't that be enough?
No, it's
Why
not. Especially in cases like this, you have to ensure that the person who is reading the test actually understands it. And one can ensure that through giving that person a reading test.
And what's that reading test called?
Well, there's different ones. The one that was used in this case was called the Wide Range Achievement Test, the 4th edition. And
is there an acronym for that one?
RAT.
Go ahead.
Or RAT4 in this case, because it's the 4th edition. And it's a simple and easy to give test. And the reason that it's important is that, even I've seen folks who have graduated from college who still read at a 3rd grade level. You need to make sure that the person understands what they're reading. Otherwise, the data that you're going to be getting is going to be bad. It's just common sense.
Would you agree there was an individual who testified before you? Would you agree that in this case, and his opinion was that, well, Dr. Janine DeMarte, the only reason was doing that was to get more money from the prosecution. Would you agree that with that statement as it applies in this case?
With all due respect, I wouldn't, because to ensure that the reading level was adequate would probably take 5 minutes.
I don't have any other questions. Thank you.
Cross-examination.
Good, evening, Dr. Hayes. Good evening.
Good evening.
What you were just talking about with regard to making sure the person is able to read before they take the MMPI, you said it takes about 5 minutes?
Yes.
And in order to make sure that they can read, can't you can also just give them something to read, can't you?
You wouldn't. Here's the problem. If you just give them something to read, you're not going to have any normed-based information on which to draw your opinion. When Dr. DeMarte gave the RAT4, what she was able to get back was an actual grade score for where Miss Arias fell. And in this case, she was at the 12th grade level for reading. The MMPI, depending on which questions you're reading or which author you're believing, is going to be written at the 6th to 8th grade reading level.
Let me stop you there.
Sustained.
Well, it's non-responsive.
All right, sustained.
Okay. If before Dr. Mmpi gives this rat test, she has read through thousands of pages of a diary that Miss Arias wrote herself, and she finds that she's able to read through these diaries and they make perfect sense, and they're not, the spelling is correct, and they're following an order so that they're making sense to read. And if she's reviewed that, and then she's also reviewed text messages that go back and forth between a conversation with Miss Arias and other people, so she's able to understand, she's able to see that there's a conversation going back and forth, that Miss Arias is clearly able to follow this conversation. And if she has access to another doctor's report that tells her that Miss Arias has an IQ score of 112, if she has all of that information prior to giving the MMPI, isn't that enough to say that she can read at a 5th grade level and conduct the MMPI?
Well, it's more than 5th.
Okay.
For one, it's probably 6th to 8th, and some say even some questions are going to be higher than that.
Okay,
But
isn't it enough then to say that she can read at a 6th to 8th grade level?
no, and I'd like to explain why. Because I can tell you, if Dr. Mmpi would have sat up here and had not done that, then someone would have criticized her for not doing that. And so it really is best practice for her just to take the 5 minutes and do it. What does it hurt?
So you're saying that you can conduct a complete rat test in 5 minutes?
No, I'm saying that you can conduct the reading recognition, and that way you can get a grade level on where that person falls in terms of his or her reading recognition.
Okay, but she conducted the entire rat test, didn't she?
I don't think she did. I think she just did reading recognition. I'll check.
Okay.
No, just reading recognition.
Okay, and so despite knowing that Miss Arias had 112 IQ, you still think she had to make sure she could read?
Absolutely, because if she didn't, she would have been crucified.
Oh, okay. So basically the only purpose for doing it then is to make sure that she's not cross-examined for why she didn't do it. Is that what you mean?
That, and to make 100% sure that there is no problem with her reading.
Okay.
It's always a possibility. I would have done it.
Okay. You were talking about the MMPI. I believe you said that it was helpful to diagnose borderline.
Yes.
Is that right? But it's not actually a test that is supposed to be used to diagnose personality disorders, right?
No test should be used to diagnose something. Again, it's like what Mr. Martinez was saying.
Let me stop you there, because the thing is when I'm talking about the MMPI, using it, it's an instrument to talk about personality characteristics, right?
Personality characteristics as well as psychopathology.
Okay, and it's something that we're talking about that is based on a person's personality that we expect to remain static, right?
Yes and no. There's going to be what's called state characteristics as well as trait characteristics, because a person's situation that they're in may affect some of the way that they answer some of those questions. For example, if
Dr.
you...
Hayes, or I guess objection, non-responsive. Okay. The MMPI, when that was created, that was normed against a general population, right?
It was. Well,
Okay.
actually, the first MMPI was normed against people that were in Minnesota.
I'm sorry, the MMPI too.
Yes.
The one that we're talking about. So it's normed against people who don't have psychological disorders, right?
That don't have...
Psychological disorders.
It was based on what was considered to be a normal population, but I would probably use normal in air quotes.
Okay, so when we talk about normal, in other words, it's normed against people that they're not necessarily known to have psychological
Yes,
disorders.
no
right?
identifiable that I'm aware of. So.
Okay, all right, and then the MCMI, are you familiar with that test?
I am.
And that test is actually normed against people who are known to have psychological disorders, right?
That's correct.
And the MCMI, that test is specifically designed, maybe not to give us a complete diagnosis on just that one test, but it is designed to tell us more about specifically personality disorders, isn't it?
No.
It doesn't tell us anything about personality disorders?
No, you said to give us more. I mean, actually, more research has been done on personality disorders with regard to the MMPI than the MCMI. The MCMI is another great test, but so is the MMPI. I use them both. They're both fine.
Okay, but when we're talking about personality disorders, we're talking about the MCMI being specifically normed against people who are known to have personality disorders, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so if you have a hypothesis about a personality disorder, wouldn't you want to use the test that is normed against personality disorders?
If I could, I would give both. In most situations, though, if given the choice of just being able to do one or the other, I would probably choose the MMPI because it's had probably 10 times as much research done on it as the MCMI.
Okay, you would use the MMPI to help diagnose personality disorders?
No, I'm saying if I only could give one, because both of them are pretty long, then I would probably choose the MMPI because I think it's better researched and it's going to give you more information.
Well, I mean, you're not limited. Let's assume that
you're
not limited to just giving one. So if you're going to talk about personality disorders, don't you agree that the MCMI is the test that talks about personality disorders, that tells us more about personality disorders?
I think that the MCMI is great for helping determine whether a person has characteristics that are similar to people with personality disorders, but the MMPI has the same it's research-based as well, and there's research on the MMPI related to what types of scales would be elevated if a person had a certain sort of personality disorder.
So MCMI is what you're saying is that the MCMI is a great test to determine use with personality disorders.
I think they both are very good.
Okay. With regard to the TSI, using the TSI-1 versus the TSI-2, you've never used the TSI-2, is that right?
No, I haven't.
And in fact, the last time you gave the TSI was in 2010, is that right?
I believe so.
So it's not something that you're doing very recently at all, right?
I'm sorry?
It's not something you're giving very recently?
No, not in the past couple of years.
Okay. And I'm sorry, did you say something? Okay.
No.
Ultimately, you'd agree that it's best to use updated tests, right?
One would not want to use obsolete tests, but one would also want to make sure that the test that you're going to be using is research-based and actually does what it's supposed to do.
And when a new test is coming out, like if we're talking about the TSI, when a new test is coming out, people who are in that specific area, so if the TSI, that deals with trauma, right? Mm-hmm. Is that a yes?
Yes, I'm sorry.
That's okay. And so people who are dealing with trauma as a specialty, they are going to know that this TSI is coming out, right?
Oh, sure. Generally.
And in fact, before the TSI-2 comes out, there is trainings on it, and there's obviously research done before it's approved to be released, right?
Generally, the research is going to be done by the authors of the test who actually stand to gain from people buying the test. And so that is why many psychologists wait until independent researchers have actually done their studies, because if you're making a decision to buy a new test based upon the research that was done by someone who stands to gain as a result of selling the test, that's why we want to wait in many cases.
So waiting 7 months is acceptable to you?
Yes, and it's also, according to the peer-reviewed literature, there is no set cutoff date.
Well, and that's because in the peer-reviewed literature, they want to make sure, they want to give the doctor latitude to determine a good reason why they might want to wait to use an updated test. Right?
Your question, I don't understand. Can you rephrase?
Sure. The literature that you're referring to, and just in general, when we talk about using outdated versus updated tests, one of the things that doctors in your area, psychologists, would want to have is latitude to decide to use this updated test. That's what the literature is telling you.
Okay, first off, I wouldn't say that it was outdated. I would say that there was an updated test. I would agree with you there.
Okay.
But I absolutely agree with you that you need latitude, because the psychologist who's making the choices of what test he or she is going to use is going to base what test he or she is going to use, hopefully, on sound methodology and reasoning.
So based on that, then, you would want to have a good reason, right? The psychologist would want to have a good reason to wait to use an updated test.
I would think so.
And for you, a good reason would be to make sure that it's being researched and it's being used by other people first to make sure that it's a good test.
You definitely would want to wait for that. The other possibility would be that there's so much a wealth of research on the old one, especially in specific populations. So say I gave a test to the court reporter, and then that would be a specific test to court reporters. So you want to find out about anxiety in let's use the spinal disorders group again. That's a very specific group. And so a lot of times when these tests come out, it's just for a generalized population. But if I want to look specifically at court reporters and spinal disorders group, that research may not have been conducted yet. And so I would want to wait and make sure that a good database of researches is there before I switch. Because if I actually have to test the court reporter, I want to make sure that.
So another reason to wait would be to make sure that the test works.
Absolutely.
Okay. But if you were told that the reason that the person gave the outdated test or didn't give the updated test is simply because she just didn't own it, not having anything to do with waiting to make sure it's tested or waiting to make sure it's a good test, just simply because she didn't have it, you'd consider that not a good reason, right?
I actually consider that to be one of the reasons. It's a little crass to say, but a lot of these tests are kind of expensive. And so to switch from one to the other, it can be costly.
So based on what you're telling us, it's okay to not use an updated test just because it costs too much?
No, I'm saying there's many different reasons. You have to look at what the person's reasoning is, whether is it research-based, is it due to cost, is it due to the fact that there are subpopulations that you want to make sure that the test works with. And so...
So one of those reasons that you're saying is it's okay to wait to use an updated test because it costs too much. That's one of the reasons, right?
In some cases... that is some reasoning, because some of these are over $1,500, and so
did you know how much the TSI-2 cost?
I think the TSI-2 is probably around $200 something.
$200?
I think so.
And so
don't quote me because I haven't priced it.
Okay, but if it's about $200, that's a good enough reason for somebody to wait 7 months to give it.
I didn't say that. I said that a person may want to wait for a number of reasons. One would be the research base. Two would be subpopulations. Three
no, I heard your reasons. What I'm saying is if you're told that this person said, I waited because my employer didn't buy it yet for me, and so her employer doesn't spend $200 to get the updated test, do you agree that that's a good reason to wait?
We're talking about 7 months, and so that is, again, you're only talking about one data point. What you're doing is you're looking at, imagine the Titanic. You are looking at one chair on the Titanic, and you're saying that...
Non-responsive.
Sustained.
Do you agree or do you not agree that waiting 7 months because you couldn't spend $200 to get the updated test is a good idea?
With a 7-month window, I don't think it's going to make a difference.
Okay. With regard to the summary scales on the TSI, you had to actually call somebody to find out if it's required?
Absolutely.
Okay, because that's not something you knew ahead of time?
My understanding was that it wasn't. And so given the significance of this case, I mean, it's a murder case. I don't want to sit up here and potentially be wrong, so absolutely. I called and verified. Okay.
And with regard to the summary scales, they're not required, right?
No.
And in fact, there are instructions on how to give this test, aren't there?
I'm sorry?
Instructions on how to give the TSI?
Yes.
Okay, and in part of the instructions, it tells you how to score it, right?
In the instruction manual, yes.
And when it tells you how to score it, it also tells you how to score the summary scales.
Actually, no.
Oh, it doesn't?
No. There was not a way to score the summary scales in the hand score version. It was based on a confirmatory factor analysis that the test authors considered to be too complex.
So what you're telling this jury is that when you hand score a TSI, there is no possible way to score the summary scales.
That's absolutely what I'm telling them based upon what my knowledge was and confirmation by the test publisher.
And just to be sure, the last time you gave a TSI was in 2010, right?
That's correct, and that's the one that you're referring to with the summary scales.
And you were still hand scoring in 2010?
I'm sorry?
You were still hand scoring in 2010?
Yes. It's not that difficult.
All right, let's talk about floating profiles.
About floating?
Floating profiles, okay. You were asked questions about floating profiles. Give me a second. And you referred to research that was, or an article that was published by Dr. Gatchell. He was one of the authors, right? In 2006, you said?
Yes. The one that I was looking at was first published by, the first author was Haggard.
Haggard, right? And another author was Stoll.
And then Gatchell was at the end because he's probably the main man. Once you get to be of a certain stature, you take last author instead of first author and put your students first.
I'm sorry. And as the main man in this particular article, that's because Dr. Gatchell had done other work with regard to floating profiles, didn't he?
His seminal work on it was in 2006.
I'm sorry?
His seminal work on floating profiles was in 2006. The article that you're holding is in 2008. And so, yes, he had done another study on it.
So he did another study in 2008 after 2006?
That's correct.
Okay. And in that study, he talks about how he doesn't refer to floating profiles anymore. He changes the name to disability profiles, doesn't he?
I brought a copy.
Do you need to refer to it?
If you don't mind.
No, that's fine. I just have to mark it down.
It's probably the same.
All right, so I'm handing you back the mark as Exhibit 655.
Thank you.
All right, and so this is the article that's done by Dr. Gatchell in 2008, right?
That's correct.
And at the front of this article, on the top page, or on the top of the page is, what's that called when you have a little paragraph like that?
I'm sorry?
On the top of the first page, what's that called when you have that little first paragraph?
The abstract.
Okay, and the abstract is like a summary of what the article is about, right?
That's right.
And in the abstract, he specifically refers to the floating profile as it's been formally known, right?
As it's been.
It's been formally known as the floating profile.
Yes.
And he talks about it being used to identify treatment complications in the context of pain management, right?
Yes, because that was the population with whom he worked.
Right. And so he was working with the population with regard to people in pain management.
In what?
In pain management.
Yes.
Okay. And he now calls it, as of 2008, he calls it a disability profile, doesn't he?
He calls it a disability profile, but it's still the same thing. Whether it's a Chevy or a Ford, it's still a car.
Right, but Dr. DeMarte didn't call it a disability profile, right? She called it a floating profile.
Yes.
Okay, but Dr. Gatchell is now calling it a disability profile, right?
Only as it applies to his spinal disorder patients. He had COSD patients, and you can actually see it in 2 different places in the article.
Well, in this particular article, though, he is talking about his patient population of pain management people, right?
Yes.
And these pain management people also had, some of them had borderline personality too, right?
Absolutely.
And so the fact that they had both, you can't just ignore that Dr. Gatchell is talking about the pain management. That's his population that he's dealing with, right?
You have to look and see what population is being written upon in order to make any sense of the study.
Okay, and so the population that he is writing about is pain management, not a population of borderline.
The population that he's writing about is patients who he's seeing for pain management, but who also had, many of them had borderline personality disorder.
Along with the pain management, right?
Correct.
And he was treating them for pain management.
That was the reason that he was seeing them, yes.
Okay, and so it just so happened that some of them also had borderline as well.
I don't think it just so happened. What he noticed was that this kind of inner emotional turmoil and turbulence that a person would have was also correlated with pain management.
The borderline is also correlated with pain management.
Right.
All right. You were asked questions about the PDS scale, right? The PDS test.
Yes.
And you didn't review that as part of getting ready to testify.
No.
And you were asked questions about whether or not if a person lied about the trauma, that would cause problems for you believing the rest of the test.
Yes, that's common
Is that true?
sense. Yes.
Okay. But if the person lied about how the trauma occurred, but there's still a trauma, then that doesn't necessarily invalidate the rest of the test, does it?
If you presuppose that the person who is answering is telling you the truth about everything else, then it wouldn't invalidate it. But if you presuppose that if the person would lie once, it's the potential that they would lie again, then there would be some significant questions about it.
And you don't know either, right?
I'm sorry?
You don't know either.
Honestly, if you know absolutely for sure that a person's lying at one time, how do you know that they're telling the truth when all of the rest of the questions are subjective?
Well, let me ask you this. When we're talking about a trauma, and we're talking about the PDS, and we're talking about the effects, or whether or not the person meets the criteria for post-traumatic stress, right? Is that a yes?
Yes.
Okay. So, if we're talking about a trauma, and the person writes down on the test that the trauma was caused by being attacked by a bear, and then later says, oh, I was wrong. It wasn't a bear, I lied. It was a tiger. Is that going to, in your opinion, does that invalidate the rest of the test? Or the results of the test, I should say.
So what I hear you saying is that the person is saying at time one that it was a bear that attacked him, and at time two it was a tiger that attacked him.
Yes, but the attack still existed.
I would be very concerned because what you're looking at is the seminal event, the event that occurred that is causing this person. I mean, if you look at the gateway criteria for PTSD, the person has to be involved in an event that causes them to experience intense helplessness, horror, in which they feel like their lives or the lives of others might be at risk.
Right.
And certainly that would apply whether you are being attacked by a bear or whether you're being attacked by a tiger or
so either
whatever
one of those
predatory animal you want to use.
So either one, whether it's a tiger or a bear, the person can still experience the same feelings.
They can, but when this is self-report, if you know that the initial seminal event was a lie, then how do you know that all of the symptoms that are supposed to have stemmed from that event are true? You don't.
Well, I'm telling, but just like we're assuming that the seminal event is a lie, let's assume that the seminal event about a tiger being attacked by a tiger, let's assume for a second that that's not true, and then let's assume that the event changes and it's a bear that actually attacked. The person is still going through an attack, right?
Yes.
Presumably. And the person would, if they're still going through an attack, whether it's a tiger or a bear, is going to still feel those feelings of helplessness and terror, things like that. Presumably, right?
I mean, if you're mauled by a tiger and you're mauled by a bear, you've got incontrovertible proof. I mean, you've got claw marks and things like that. And so this example, again, is presupposing that there is an absolute seminal event that has occurred.
Right.
And so in that case, maybe the person, I mean, if you want to give them the benefit of the doubt, had a misperception. And so certainly the symptoms could still be there. But again...
So let me stop you there. The symptoms, so whether it's a tiger or a bear, you would agree that the symptoms are still there if there's an attack, right?
If you have incontrovertible proof that the person had been mauled, like the claw marks and things like that, then sure.
Well, when people report traumas on Ph.D. or TSIs, you don't always have incontrovertible proof, do you?
No, but I also don't always see people lying.
That doesn't invalidate tests just because you don't have incontrovertible proof.
I think you're mixing things up a little bit. One is the issue of lying about the seminal event. And what I was saying is if you know that the person is lying about the seminal event, but they have incontrovertible proof, like the claw marks, then clearly you could still have the difficulties. But if it's a situation where there isn't incontrovertible proof, then, and you're basically having to take the person's word at face value that he or she experienced this event, then there's no objective data that you can reference to make sure that it actually happened.
And so when we talk about objective data, you would want to look to other tests also, right?
Well, the test, it literally is one piece of the puzzle.
Exactly.
You want to look to more. You want to look to the person's records, to collateral interviews, to your forensic interview, to the observations that you see.
And you can also look at other tests, can't you?
Absolutely.
And you would do that, wouldn't you? You would conduct other tests besides just a PDS, wouldn't you?
Let me just clarify. When Mr. Martinez had asked me that question, he was asking me related to if you knew the person lied on test A, the first one that you gave.
I'm not talking about lying.
That's why I'm confused about what you're asking me.
Okay, I'm not talking about lying. I'm talking about the fact that if you're not sure if you can trust the results of a PDS test showing that the criteria is supporting PTSD, okay, if you're not sure about that, there are other objective tests that can tell you or give you a working hypothesis for PTSD, aren't there?
Are we getting off the topic of lying about the seminal event?
I am not talking about lying at all.
Okay.
I'm not talking about tigers and bears.
I wasn't sure if you switched topics or we were still on tigers, bears, and lying.
No, we're done with tigers and bears.
Okay.
So the question is if you, I'm just talking about if you're concerned about the PDS test and whether or not you can trust its results, there are other tests that are objective that can also give us a working hypothesis that supports PTSD, aren't there?
Definitely.
Okay. All right. And if you have other objective tests that give you a working hypothesis that supports anxiety or PTSD or trauma, you can't just ignore those, right? You need to look at those tests, don't you?
Yes.
And consider those in your evaluation.
Yes.
You told us that you, as of the last 4 years, you're about 50-50 testifying for prosecution and defense?
Yes.
And you've testified or worked on 4 capital cases, is that right?
Yes.
And that's death penalty cases?
Yes, and I think 2 are in the penalty phase and 2 are in the guilt phase. And then I wasn't sure when I told you yesterday, I think some of the, on the other side, I think 3 were murders. I'm not sure if they were charged as first degrees because, like, in one of them, they weren't competent to stand. The individual wasn't competent to stand trial, and so I'm not positive what the. Not positive.
Whether they were capital or not, is that what you mean?
Right.
Okay. So, but can we say that you've worked on 4 murder cases? Do you think that's accurate?
It was 4 murders that were capital that I'm 100% sure of.
Okay. And in those 4 capital cases, and this is what we had discussed last night, that occurred in the last about 4 years?
Yes.
Okay. And in that last 4 years, you testified...
Actually, it was a little bit more because one of the ones that I was thinking of was more than 4 years because I looked back at my list of cases that I've done.
Okay, a little bit more than 4 years. And out of those 4 cases that we're talking about, you testified for the prosecution in all of those, right?
I was retained on behalf of the prosecution, yes.
Okay. And you told us that you were originally licensed in 1999?
That's right.
So that would put you at practicing for about 14 years. Is that right?
About.
I know it's hard to do math at this time, but from 1999 to 2013, right?
Yes.
And is that how you would count the number of years that you practice?
Yes.
And you certainly wouldn't count years before you were licensed as practicing, would you?
I would say that I had experience. In my personal opinion, the way that I would handle that is I would say, well, I've had experience. Because,
Okay.
like, for example, I've had experience working with police officers since after my first master's degree. But I wasn't licensed, and so I wouldn't say that I practiced in that area, because to me, saying that you practice pre-assumes that you have a license.
Okay, so you wouldn't say that you've practiced psychology until after you had your license, right?
I wouldn't. Some other folks may, but it wouldn't be my choice of terms.
You wouldn't do it?
No.
All right, thank you, nothing.
Redirect.
With regard to the PDS and the tiger and the bear, and assuming that the individual first says it's a tiger, it's a lie, and then changes it to a bear. Assume that, which was the question you were being asked, okay?
Yes.
What if previous to that they said it was a gopher? Would that even make it difficult for you to continue on with that test and say that it's valid?
I was actually with you at just tiger and bear, saying it's invalid if, if there's actually no physical symptoms or anything to suggest that it was a tiger bear. If you add a gopher, then, it's just further confirmatory evidence that the person lies.
And does that talk or speak to the validity of that PDS result?
Absolutely.
And what does it speak to? What does it say?
Again, if what you're basing your opinion on is, or what you're getting the results of, you're adding up the check boxes and things. If the event either didn't occur or didn't occur how the person said it did, well, then you can't be sure that the alleged symptoms are actually true.
And as in my example, first it's a gopher, changed it to the bear, and then changes it to the tiger. Again, does that give you any pause in deciding whether or not to consider that test valid?
I think that's just common sense, yes.
And with regard to these floating profiles and the article that you were shown, does that article indicate that the concept of floating profiles as it is applied to the area of borderline personality disorders is something that should be out the window?
No, and in fact, the author is quite clear that he just termed it disability profile because of the patient population that he was working with. He didn't say don't use floating. In fact, just changing the name doesn't change anything. And in fact, he said this actually was the best way to tell whether there were certain treatment complications and treatment usage and things. It actually was validated by him.
I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Any questions from the jury for this witness? You may step down.
Thank you.
Any other testimony, counsel?
State press.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your patience and staying tonight so that we could finish the testimony. Tomorrow morning, please be here at 9:15. We will start at 9:30, but I would like you to be here at 9:15. Please remember the admonition. Have a nice evening. Drive safely.
Please stand for the jury.